Sorry, yeah, we do have a quorum, so we can get going. Larry, I don't know if you heard that, but we're ready to go. Okay. So before we get started, Sharon, I just need to read back the Safer at Home order.
Okay.
So everyone, due to the Safer at Home order issued by Governor Cooper, members of the Bicycle, Pedestrian, Active Mobility Advisory Committee are participating virtually. All members will vote by roll call. The member will be recognized, at which time the member will state his or her vote. So with that, Sharon, I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. How are we doing? Okay. We're here. We've made it into 2021, and so far that's not a whole lot better than last year, but at least it's a new year. We'll keep our fingers crossed that things continue to go uphill from here. Thanks for being here and taking time and being part of this group. Really quickly, before we move on into the rest of the agenda, I don't think we've clarified, but each month before our meeting, Keith and I have a meeting with Matthew where we sort of review what was discussed at the last meeting and set an agenda for the coming meeting. And in that conversation, one of the things that we're sort of sorting through is, one, how this all works. So I don't know about the rest of you, but Keith and I are new to being part of this type committee, which is different than serving on a board for a nonprofit organization or other types of working committees. So we're learning our roles and how that fits into the overall hierarchy within the city. And then also how that helps us guide this group and come to some action items that we can actually engage around. So that sort of tees up how we laid out the agenda for this meeting and what Matthew will talk about in a little bit. And then the first thing, just making sure that everyone has done the diversity and harassment prevention training, checking in to see if anyone has had any issues accessing that, and then make sure you send that form back to Matthew if you haven't already. Any questions on that? Okay.
Most everybody has. There were just a few outstanding yet. So thank you, everybody, for doing that. I appreciate that.
It's not super long. It's a YouTube video, and it's laid out really well and pretty clear to understand. So you can stop and start if you can't watch the whole thing at one time too. Okay, and then next up, Matthew sent out a copy of the minutes from our last meeting. Were there any corrections or additions to be made to those? Anyone? Okay. Motion to approve those?
I'll make the motion to approve them.
I will second them.
Great. And Matthew, as I'm still learning, do we need to do a roll call vote on those, or?
Yeah, we'll do the roll call on that. And so there's no further discussion. I'll just go through the roster and everybody just speak up when it's your turn. So Keith, you made the motion, so you approve. Greg seconded, so approval there. John, do you approve the minutes from December?
Yes.
Michael?
Approved.
All right. Donna?
Approve.
All right. Sharon?
Approved.
AJ?
Approved.
And Cynthia?
Approved.
Thank you. Okay.
Great. Thank you all. So then teeing up Matthew's conversation, again, Keith and I are new to, well, this is a new commission, which we've talked about before, and it was great to hear your thoughts and ideas put forth in the meeting in our last meeting in December. And we felt like it would be great to hear sort of an overview of what's actually going to be taking place this year. What's already planned, what's already funded, what the city is planning to do, and have Matthew relay that to us so that we can then form ourselves around those existing projects, things that are already in the works, and then see where the gaps are or where we need to support. We had some fairly clear interest out of the last discussion. So we know we're interested in safety, we're interested in looking at rail trails or other ways to expand our trail system, driver education in addition to cyclist and pedestrian education. So Matthew's going to run through a presentation of what's on the table from the city and plan this year, and then from there we'll have some additional conversation around those items and prioritizing our tasks after that.
Right.
I'm good?
Perfect.
Thank you. I'm going to mute myself for a bit.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Sharon. So I think Sharon summed it up pretty well there, that, the discussion we had at the last meeting of what people are interested in pursuing and what topics was a good discussion. But at the same time, it's sometimes difficult to have that discussion of what the goals and objectives are without having a clear understanding of what the baseline is. So where are we right now? And I think after this presentation, hopefully everybody will be kind of on the same page as to where we stand. And then we can continue that discussion of what the goals of this group should be. So the way I laid this out, just sharing updates on what we are doing, the city is doing in terms of infrastructure projects, but also programming and policy and some of the support programs that we have in place as well. So kind of a really broad view of what the bike and pedestrian program is up to, and beyond that, even what the city and NCDOT are doing as it relates to bike and pedestrian infrastructure and programming. So I'm going to share my screen here so you can see the presentation. Okay. Can everybody see that now? Yes. Okay, great. So like I said, we'll go through engineering and the infrastructure improvements, but then I'll also kind of take a dive into the other elements of the program as well, and share some of the updates on as it relates to those projects as well. And along the way, feel free to speak up if you have questions about what's going on. I want this to be a discussion rather than just a presentation, so feel free to speak up. So when we talk about engineering and infrastructure projects, we're talking about the physical improvements. That's typically what people think of when we're talking about transportation. As it relates to bike and pedestrian, there's a little more emphasis compared to, say, automobile planning and infrastructure design. There's more emphasis in the bike and pedestrian world on some of those support programs, because these aren't the dominant modes necessarily right now. So we do need to do some additional work beyond just building infrastructure. But this is, what people typically think of when we're talking about transportation projects. So, obviously breaking that out, we have bicycle, pedestrian, and then Greenway projects. And there's a lot of overlap between them. Obviously, greenways are open for walking and running and biking. Some people, the sidewalks, which are primarily for pedestrians, but outside of downtown, cyclists are allowed to use those sidewalks as well. So there is, and even bicycle infrastructure. Say we put a bike lane on a street. It not only offers a benefit to people who are biking there, but in a lot of cases it provides a buffer between the sidewalk and where the automobiles are driving. So there's a lot of overlap between these. Oops. So pedestrian infrastructure, projects like sidewalks, intersection improvements, those are kind of the main component of the pedestrian infrastructure improvements. And that's, going through our pedestrian plan, that's what we heard from our steering committee and from the public was, in order to feel safer, clearly we need to build more sidewalks and improve the intersections and the crossings. So, that the primary component of those two elements, but there are other projects and other elements that have an impact on pedestrian safety and comfort. And bus shelters is one of those. So I'll go into some more detail on these sections as well. But bus shelters, transit, and the pedestrian infrastructure are really inextricably linked. Every transit trip begins with usually a walk to the bus station or the bus stop, transit stop, and then a walk from that transit stop to the final destination. So those two are very much linked, and we have a project going on right now that will install bus shelters throughout the city, and quite a few of them have been installed, and more are on the way, dozens of those. So that's one example of projects that aren't necessarily pedestrian specific, but obviously have a great impact on the comfort of people walking in the community. And then just thinking broadly about transportation projects, that really every transportation project and even every development project has a bike and pedestrian component to it, an impact on biking and walking. So whether that's a very highway specific project like the Beltway, the Beltway is clearly it's a way to move motor vehicles around the city, but each of those interchanges, for example, is an interchange with a surface street, and so we need to look at how people will walk through those interchanges and how they will connect over the Beltway and under the Beltway if necessary. So there's even projects that you would think of as highway projects have that bike and pedestrian component to them. Meadowlark Drive is another example. That's a bond project from several years ago, and it's going to construction soon. And it's really a roadway modernization project. It's a road that has seen a lot of development, a lot of housing and schools and commercial development, but the road has not kept pace necessarily with that development. So this is a project to modernize that road, but a pretty major component of this project is actually providing pedestrian crossings and bike and pedestrian accommodation parallel with that roadway. So every transportation project that we have has some bike and pedestrian component to it typically, and we need to be looking at those as well. And we are. So I'm personally involved with a lot of these projects, and I know our staff. A lot of people spend a lot of time on the staff, working on these projects and addressing the bike and pedestrian needs as well. Business 40 Salem Parkway project, that's the obvious example. We've been talking a lot about that. The Strollway Bridge and the Green Street Bridge and the Multiuse Path along that highway. But then also even looking at the roadway bridges that cross Business 40 and the planning and the funding and effort that go into determining sidewalk widths even along those roads. Which of those bridges should we invest the money to provide wider sidewalks, which may be sufficient with standard sidewalks? Which of those bridges needs bike lanes? All of that work goes into the bike and pedestrian component, even of a highway project like that. And another example, a local example, is two-way conversion projects. So there are two-way conversions kind of slated for Liberty and Main Streets, and then First and Second Streets as well downtown. And those as downtown transportation projects, clearly there's a strong bike and pedestrian component to those then, and the needs of people walking and biking needs to be taken into account with those projects. Any questions about kind of the pedestrian infrastructure?
Yeah, Matthew,
Yeah.
I did have one question, and this is a specific question, but I feel like it might have implications to some other projects. I lived right off of Meadowlark until recently. How much of this process, and just having been a resident there, wondered how much is being pushed on the developers to improve those roads versus the city bearing the burden?
So there are the Unified Development Ordinance, the UDO, is what dictates how development occurs and what is required. So the planning board and city county planning department kind of oversee that UDO, the development ordinance. And in there are requirements as plots develop. So along Meadowlark, for example, for developments along Meadowlark Drive that specifically front Meadowlark Drive, there, in most cases, most streets, there's a requirement to put in sidewalk. And then at times there's a requirement to even widen the street or put in turn lanes. And that's typically dictated by a traffic impact analysis. So as a larger development comes in, there's often a traffic impact analysis required, because if it's so many lots, say, of residential development, there's assumed to be a pretty great traffic impact then. So then the developer would provide that traffic impact analysis, and that would kind of dictate what kind of roadway improvements are required at that point.
Is there any opportunity over time to prioritize pedestrian and bicycle into that? That sounds mostly like traffic patterns, but I'm just wondering if there's any way to get a nod for, the city's goals on pedestrian and bicycle traffic to, maybe have that included.
So that's where, the sidewalk requirement comes in. So, if it really, that's kind of the default. So I think there are some exceptions depending on the location within the county. The very rural areas, that requirement may not apply, but pretty much throughout the county, when development occurs, then the sidewalk would come with that. And so, yeah, that part of, in that regard, the pedestrian element is taken into account. If I think after that kind of general requirement, then it's kind of a case-by-case basis of, looking at the location and the context of the development and what other kind of improvements might be required. Make sense?
Matthew, I wanted to ask a quick question.
Yeah.
On First Street, I saw that there was some concrete work being done between Liberty and Cherry Street, as well as a bulb out on First Street, I think around Poplar or Spruce. And I was just wondering about those projects.
So I don't know the specifics about specific intersections with those projects necessarily, but I know generally, along with the two-way conversion, there were pedestrian safety and comfort measures being taken as well. So like you mentioned, some of the curb extensions, the bulb outs, that's part of that project as well. I don't know the plans well enough, the construction plans well enough to be able to respond to specific locations.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay. So moving on then. If this is kind of the general view, I want to do a couple specific projects, but specific sidewalk projects that we are working on, the city's working on right now, this is a listing of those projects that we are managing. And there's these are projects that have either been funded through bond referendum through the city or through NCDOT through their prioritization process, or through funding from the MPO. So one way or another, these were priority projects from the city, and we have kind of pursued funding through all of the different options that are available. So I'm personally managing a couple of these design projects, and we're working with consultants on these projects. So we have assistance from engineering consultants. But you can see Polo Road, Barbara Jane Road, or Avenue, Fairlawn Drive, Griffith Road, Robin Hood Road, University Parkway, and Silas Creek Parkway. So these are, like I said, these are projects that have been priorities for the city, and we've actually had some funding applied to these, and are now working through the design of these projects. And specific sidewalk projects like this that are dedicated sidewalk projects, These, there's kind of a flow of these in terms of the funding availability. So at times there are a lot of city funds available, and we can kind of pick projects from our priority list. And then at other times, some of these projects they're more than sidewalk projects in some cases. Some require the design and installation of curb and gutter infrastructure and some of that almost roadway modernization infrastructure. So a lot of these include that as well. And that's why when we're looking at which funding source to use, that's important, because if you're having to design and construct curb and gutter with a sidewalk, it's obviously going to cost a lot more. And in those cases, then we at times need the assistance of those federal funds. We don't have enough locally to be able to build all of that infrastructure. So when we get federal funds from NCDOT or through our metropolitan planning organization, then those federal funds pay 80% of the project, and the local match is only 20%. So we can make those local funds go much further by using the federal funds.
Hey, Matt.
Yes.
I had a question.
Sure.
I know in the past we discussed that if we were retrofitting a sidewalk, like in a residential area, I think we get input from the residents on whether there should be a buffer there between the sidewalk and the road or not. In the case of new construction, like stuff that's happening out of Meadowlark, is there a requirement to have a buffer, or how does that work?
So yeah, with the UDO, there is there's engineering design standards that the city has, and the default is to have a buffer for a sidewalk. And now, there are cases where the terrain or the topography or other issues may impact that and not allow that, but that is the standard to have that buffer between the road and the sidewalk.
All right, thanks.
Yep.
Matthew, while we're talking about design and buffers, and this may be a detailed question that needs to be filed away for another discussion, but when we put our groups on sidewalks, and I personally use them as a runner, one thing that I bump into is street lights. And street lights, we kind of joke, are just that. They're street lights, and they don't really benefit the sidewalk at all. Is there any opportunity to look at, if we're going to encourage increased use of sidewalks to improve the lighting? And again, it may be a topic for another time. I just thought, since we're talking design, I'd throw it out there.
Yeah, so it's something, there are certain projects that have street lighting included with them. I'm thinking specifically of the projects, say in the Innovation Quarter, along Research Parkway, and those clearly adding street lighting to a sidewalk project is going to increase the cost. So it's a balance of, do we spend more money on a single project or limited number of projects and put the street lighting in, or do we spend money on more sidewalks throughout the community? And in that case, maybe you can't get quite the level of amenities that you would if you were focusing on just a few projects. So I think that's a discussion that goes on all the time, of striking that balance. And I think, this group could certainly weigh in on that. And, maybe there are certain locations where the lighting is really crucial. Maybe there's some other locations where the lighting maybe isn't as important. I think that's a discussion when we're kind of looking at scoping projects and figuring out, what the project will involve. That discussion happens then. Especially if, say, there's a mid-block crossing somewhere, and we need that to be very visible. I mentioned there's a couple projects here that I'm working on, and Polo Road is one of those, and there are mid-block crossings associated with the Polo Road project. And that's one of the things we're having the consultant do, is a lighting analysis to figure out if the lighting is sufficient at those mid-block crossings. Because obviously at night, if you have a mid-block crossing, you need that to be a very visible location. So we can do some analysis then and figure out what needs to be added, if anything, for lighting.
I have a question on the sidewalk, the sidewalks that you guys are looking at, the one you're showing right here.
Yeah.
When you come, I'm guessing this is to repair, also prepare broken down sidewalks where the tree roots have lifted them and they're kind of just not really safe for somebody walking. When you guys encounter like an old tree with large tree roots that are pushing up the sidewalk, do you guys generally take down that tree, or do you look for ways to save the tree and maintain the integrity of the sidewalk?
That's a good question, and it's something I didn't include in this presentation is the maintenance side of things. So I've been focusing on new construction, but there is a separate maintenance budget for sidewalk and a separate program for that. So I'm glad you raised that question. So there are essentially there are requests that come in from the public, say about a needed sidewalk repair. In a lot of cases, it is a situation where tree roots have pushed up a segment of sidewalk. And yeah, I mean, the default is, to save that tree but to repair the sidewalk at the same time. So depending on the severity of it, it may be a case where we can just shave down the sidewalk essentially and remove any kind of lift that's there. That's the simplest. If it's more severe, then there may be a need to remove a segment or so of the sidewalk and then replace that completely. It's really, very much context sensitive. It really depends on the location and, the age and size of the tree and, what kind of the width of the planting strip that's there. And so it's hard to say, provide a general response for that, but it's something that is just examined on a case-by-case basis.
Do you know if the city of Winston-Salem has ever heard of or considered the use of like rubber sidewalks when they're replacing sidewalks? It's like a special sidewalk material that's made with rubber, so it's flexible.
So not necessarily rubber, but I know in Old Salem, for instance, where there are trees, and we've had, if you've walked through Old Salem, the brick sidewalks there, and there's pretty severe issues with roots, tree roots lifting up those bricks and really causing an uneven walking surface. There's actually a product that was used in Old Salem for specifically that issue, and it's essentially you make the sidewalk out of a small stone, and then there's a treatment that is poured over that to secure it and adhere all those stones together. So not necessarily rubber. I just don't know if there's even such a product, or there probably is, but the long-term maintenance of that. But there are products out there that we have used that accomplish that same goal. So I could probably send some photos, or if the next time you're in Old Salem walking, take a look and you'll see where those, it goes from brick to that small stone, and you'll see where it was done and how that works. It's a fairly nice surface. It seems to be holding up well too.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay. So if that's the linear sidewalks along the roadway, one of the other major comments we receive and priorities that people have is actually crossing streets. Because if you're walking along a street and you need to cross the other side and there is no way to do that, then and that's a major barrier. And so recently there's been a real emphasis on looking at the safety of intersections and making improvements to those intersections for pedestrian crossings. I think it was about a year and a half ago, City Council had requested an analysis to figure out where some of the biggest issues we had with intersection crossings as far as pedestrian access goes. So we did an analysis and came up with a prioritized list of projects, and they actually devoted $2 million to designing and constructing those improvements at those intersections. And this is at least a partial listing of those intersections. You can see, at the list there. If you have any specific questions about them, let me know. I would say that the last 5 bullets there was Broad and Salem, Ronalda and Grayland, 3rd Street and Patterson, Miller, Silas Creek, and then Allister and Peacehaven. Those are all projects that are either under construction right now or were recently completed. And One thing of note I would say is Ronaldo Road and Grayland Court. That's actually an improvement that Wake Forest University paid for and constructed. So, we are always looking for those public-private partnership opportunities as well, to extend, the kind of the reach of making these improvements. If we have private organizations like that making improvements, then the city can invest in other areas. And it's just stretching the money that we have. So we did a study with Wake Forest a number of years ago, and that was one of the recommendations, was that improvement at Ronaldo and Grayland, because we know, clearly there's a lot of bike and pedestrian traffic there as people cross Ronaldo Road. So it was a priority for everybody, and Wake Forest stepped up to fund and construct that improvement. Any questions about these intersection improvements?
Matthew, just while you're talking about that sort of situation where Wake Forest did fund that improvement and completed that, when you realize there are gaps, or I know that your list is far longer than any funds could ever possibly cover, who does fundraising? Do you actively seek private funds, or is that more passive?
Yeah, it depends on the location of the improvement that's needed and the desire of the organization involved. So, on the staff side, there's no fundraising necessarily from private sources. We really do have our hands full with managing MPO funds and NCDOT funds, and then the local city funds. But there are times when, with Ronaldo and Grayland as an example, that's a priority for Wake Forest, and they did not want to wait to see that happen. So, it was because it was a priority for them, they put the funding up to make that happen. So, I think the best thing we can do is continue to work on plans like that with organizations. And so if there's a need that an organization like that comes to us with, to develop that plan that identifies projects within it, really just creating those partnerships with those organizations rather than fundraising. It's kind of just the development of those relationships, and then that kind of naturally leads to that kind of investment, I think.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
I have a quick question
about this. Oh, I'm sorry, Michael, did you say something?
Yeah, I have a quick question about the place on Ronaldo. So if, Wake funds that, do they manage that project, or do they kind of just pass it on to the city, and the city's kind of over that?
So they manage the construction of that, and what they do then, they get an encroachment agreement from the city. So that means that anytime a private organization like that wants to do some construction or maintenance or whatever it is in the public road, then they're required to get approval, essentially, from the city to do that. And that was the case there, where they wanted to fund the project. They paid to have it designed and constructed, and what they were required to do then was get approval from the city. So the city reviews those plans and kind of oversees some of the construction, but it's really the responsibility of the organization that wants to make the improvement then. And one thing I'll say about this is the intersections we had, and this is not any different from the sidewalks really, but we did a map analysis essentially of where we had signalized intersections that did not have pedestrian signals, and where there was a history of crashes, and where we had high volumes and high speeds, and we kind of, it's called GIS, Geographic Information System, and we were able to overlay all of those different data sources together and start to see a picture of where the improvements are most needed. I believe we have about almost 500 signalized intersections in the city, and I want to say there must have been 200 or 300 of them that need pedestrian signalization. So really one of the biggest challenges is just narrowing down the priorities of where we invest the funding that we do have. With that many signalized intersections that need pedestrian signals, we can't just haphazardly apply funding to certain locations and hope that they're the most needed. We really do need to do that analysis and figure out where the funding that we do have is best invested. So that was part of the process of identifying these projects, and then and that's what we're doing, say, with the pedestrian plan as well, and with the bicycle plan. That's really the main challenge, is trying to figure out where we can best invest those funds. So bike lanes. So you can see the projects that we've recently completed this fall, the ones that are about to go to construction now, and then what we have planned for the future. So we have been working through some older projects that we had designed a while back. We've been constructing those. But once those are done, then we need to turn to our current bike master plan and start to identify projects from that plan and start doing some feasibility on those, and then trying to find funding to actually construct them. And I think there's certainly a role for this group in that process. We have a plan in place, but there are many more needs than there are funds, and this group can help us again identify which priorities we should be pursuing. So these projects were the ones that we recently completed and are currently going on. A mix of bike lanes and buffered bike lanes and shared lane markings. So the infrastructure that we select for certain roadways, again, it's very context sensitive. It depends on the roadway width and the number of lanes and a number of different factors, and on-street parking, and the list goes on. So we'll look at all those factors and then come up with a design accordingly. So Greenway Infrastructure, here are the projects that we have are working on as it relates to greenways. Some of these are funded and are being designed, like Brushy Fork, Greenway, Little Creek, Piedmont Regional, the Strollway, Salem Parkway, the Multiuse Path phases 1 and 2. And then a couple of the projects are, actually these are funded as well, but we're working on, say, a feasibility study for Salem Creek Greenway extension. And then we're also doing, it's not necessarily a Greenway project, but it's in the meantime, until we can figure out how to extend Salem Creek Greenway, we are working on a project to provide an alternative route to essentially connect the two locations we want to connect with the Greenway, but it may take some time to complete that Greenway. So in the meantime, we're providing an alternate route. But you can see quite a few different Greenway projects. In a lot of cases, these projects are connecting existing pieces of our Greenway network or extending pieces of the Greenway network, rather than building in isolated areas. So we're really focusing on building out the network and making sure everything is connected so that, for transportation purposes, you can reach more destinations, and for recreation purposes, you can have a longer walk, run, or ride on those greenways and be able to connect to the different areas of the city. Any questions about any of these projects specifically? A little bit of detail here. So these are.
Hello?
Oh, go ahead.
Quick question. How does this work with the creative corridors? Was that something different, or?
No, it is tied in. So, Creative Corridors is one of those non-governmental organizations, the nonprofit, that they were very much instrumental in the multi-use path, and you can see the Green Street pedestrian bridge here and the Strollway Bridge. So, they're not necessarily involved in all of these projects, but their focus was really on, at least it has been, was on the Business 40 project. So any bike and pedestrian components related to the Business 40 project, like those bridges, that's where Creative Corridors really came through.
Hey, Matt.
Yes.
Quick question. On the multi-use path along Salem Parkway, have we already exhausted the existing funds for that, and now we have to generate new funds, or is there still money that has not been spent?
That's the latter. So we have funding from NCDOT and from the city, actually, that have been programmed for the path along Salem Parkway. And we are, the original intention was to have NCDOT build the path as part of the Business 40 project, but through a number of, they ran into some financial issues and that delayed the path component. And now the city is going to be managing those projects. So we've been kind of gearing up to begin management of those and preparing for that. And but those funds are available yet. And so, a majority of the path is actually designed and we're getting ready for construction. And then the western section of the path has not been designed yet. So we'll contract with the consultant and work on that design and work towards construction.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Matthew, as I look at this, I think that Salem Parkway feature is going to be really cool and effective over time. And I know this is a 2021 discussion. Is there anything comparable along 52 on any type of roadmap to bridge east to west or downtown to the East Winston? That's similar to this?
So what made this path an option was that the redesign of the highway. So I'm not aware of a comparable complete redesign of 52, but one project that I didn't mention here, I may mention it later when we talk about planning, is the extension of the Long Branch Trail. So, Long Branch Trail right now ends at Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. And we're working on a feasibility study to determine if we can extend that trail to the north to 27th Street. And one of the things we're looking at with that feasibility study is the access to that trail. So across 52 and actually to the west as well. So, if we're going to have that trail, how do people connect to it from the surrounding community? So, we don't have a comparable highway project along 52 because that Business 40 project was that's a major project. But there are other opportunities to look at the connections across 52, certainly.
So, Matthew, I'm going to interrupt just a second. I'm looking at the time and it's 9:45.
Yes.
I already have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sort of discussion questions on my list. And I'm wondering if we could segment this and do half today and then half on the next meeting, because it's a lot. And I want to be able to absorb it and talk about it appropriately. Sure. And I don't know how much, my question to you is how much more did you have to present? And do you feel like you want to break it or go ahead and go through the whole thing?
I think we could break it because maybe what we do today is talk about the infrastructure. There's a little bit more related to that. But then next week we could talk more about the programming side. So our Safe Routes to School program and Watch from ENC and micromobility and some of those other elements. So yeah, I'm happy. Let me just check here. This we're really pretty much at the end of the infrastructure discussion, and that would leave 10, 15 minutes for open discussion from the group. How does that sound? Perfect. Okay. Thank you, Sharon. So this is just a cut sheet from the Greenway Plan. So, again, kind of talking about the process we go through. That Greenway Plan is from, I think, 2012. So we did a lot of planning work and a lot of feasibility work at that time. And now, we've been working through some of the projects from that Greenway Plan. And Little Creek Greenway Phase 2A is one of those projects. I mentioned the Salem Creek Greenway extension. This is extending from Marketplace Mall to the west towards Forsyth Tech. So we're working on feasibility study right now to determine how we get past the two major barriers, Peters Creek Parkway and Siles Creek Parkway. And then, specific alignment. So, what you see here is really just a line on a map showing the general corridor. It's really not until you start doing some engineering feasibility that you can figure out what side of the creek and what the creek crossings will look like. The plan is really just that, a plan of where we think the priority corridors are. and then we have to spend a lot of time, working on the details of exactly what the alignment of that trail would look like. So that's the end of the infrastructure discussion. This gets into planning then, and some of the programming side of things. Sharon, would you like to open it up for discussion at this point then? And I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Thank you.
Of course.
That was great information. Like I said, I have a list of questions that mainly are centered around communication, and how the public is aware of these plans, and then how we can help respond to comments and questions and direct people to the right place. But I'd also like to hear from any of you that have questions or comments that haven't already been shared. We can just open it up. Anyone who's on mute or who has something. Okay, I'll just go ahead and dive in then. So part of this has come up as I explore other areas in my desperation to get away from home a little bit during this crazy time, trying to find other trails to ride and places to go that I haven't been before. So visiting the American Tobacco Trail in Durham, for instance, and as I go, I'm looking on websites to try to get information, or I'm finding those Facebook groups where people share information about those specific trails, and they're updating about flooding, because we've had plenty of that, or construction that's going on, and the section's closed Monday through Friday and only open on weekends, and that sort of thing. And then I'm looking at our bike plan before this meeting and just trying to familiarize myself. So my questions around where do we share this information and communicate that out to the public? Project phase updates, the timeline. So for instance, that Salem Parkway piece, where is that shared other than, and not a criticism, but kind of buried into all of these other planning documents? Is there a portal, and is there a way that that's communicated out? And then just some sort of observations around integration between other committees. So the Public Art Commission and the Historical Sign Commission. When I look at the city of Cary and I pulled up their White Oak Greenway map, I noticed that they had public art icons and they had historical markers on that map, and then a map that showed, there's a restroom here, there's only parking here, that kind of thing. So where do we put that information out, and how do we direct people to it? I'll pause at that because that's already a big question. Yeah,
so as far as the progress on projects, the city maintains I know there's a bond tracking component of the website. And so the bond projects are tracked through that. So, as there's progress on these projects, that's the main portal for sharing updates on the projects. So I can direct all of you to that. Let's see, as far as the other question related to kind of how are we sharing information about the trails? Is that
trails, updates, plan progress, that kind of thing? I guess, is there an active update that happens, or is it just a sort of a created document that sits stagnant? You know what I mean? Versus frequent updates. Here's where we are. Here's what's happening next. This is what was going on this month. This is what's planned next. Sort of regular update versus an overall plan that sits.
Well, so, as we're working on the pedestrian plan, for example, we have a specific project website for that plan, and we are regularly posting to that with updates and how people can get involved. Once the plan is completed, then that's where the real discussion begins on which projects we're going to pursue. So like with the bicycle plan, for instance, there are priority projects in the bicycle plan, but part of the discussion this group can contribute to is which of those priority projects are we actually going to pursue, because we can't even pursue all of the priorities in the bike plan. So there's just an ongoing discussion, and clearly our elected officials are involved with that. So the Public Works Committee, they're very much involved. We just presented an update to them last evening about the pedestrian plan. So those discussions are happening in several different locations. So once a plan is done, we're not necessarily going back and updating every time there's that kind of a discussion. Once we get to that point, then those discussions happen and we identify projects, then we're pursuing funding for those projects. And that's where, the bond funding comes in. That's where the MPO comes in. And each of those MPO meetings, there's again that discussion of which projects should be funded. So, those discussions and those meeting minutes and the involvement is happening in multiple locations and multiple bodies. So I like the idea of condensing that information and providing it in one location, but it's a huge undertaking because it is happening in so many locations. So I think one of the things we could talk about as a group is, what's a simple way to provide updates on where, on the progress of some of these projects and plans. Yeah. I apologize.
I knew that was a very large question to throw out there, but as I'm thinking about advocacy and how advocacy works, it's us being able to easily access information and then share it, respond to comments or tell our friends and other people that we're biking, cycling, running with, whatever.
And part of this might be just good communication. So, we have advocacy groups in town and we have met with them on a regular basis to provide updates on projects and what's going on and ways for them to get involved. So, that's a simple and pretty effective way to do this, that, we have those channels through advocacy groups that, this kind of an update that I just delivered today, this kind of gives a snapshot of where we are, and then those advocacy groups can share that and can share the opportunities that are coming up for the public to get involved. So, the pedestrian plan, for instance, will, in the near future, we'll be sharing a draft plan with the community to review. If we can share that information with those advocacy groups and they help spread the word and get people involved, that's a good relationship on both ends.
Sure.
I don't know if we have time to just throw a brainstorm idea, just something that occurred to me while we were sitting here. But, as we tackle these big plans and, acknowledging what you said about the complexity, but is there room for like a web page for our committee where we could maybe put these digestible bites, like the results of this meeting out, and then direct people back to it? Again, brainstorm type idea, maybe best discussed in another forum, but that first piece, as long as it took, was incredibly helpful to me. And if we could take some of that information that we've consolidated through this process and again, make it more digestible to the community, might get more engagement, at least it's measurable.
Yeah, I agree. I think this was a great presentation. And the education piece of it, the publicity piece, and even when you think about how it makes our city just a better city. So I would even recommend, maybe even for our next meeting, if we can do some, or if it's feasible, to do some brainstorming around how kind of an effective collaboration with other groups, as well as communication around how do we get those completed projects known, and also here's what's to come. This was a great presentation today and enlightening.
Yeah, thanks, Donna. That's exactly how I was thinking as well. But so Matthew, the next piece of your presentation was around the safety component, the programming, correct?
That's right. So, we have Safe Routes to School, a 3-year Safe Routes to School project that we're about to kick off. We have an ongoing bike and pedestrian counting program that I was going to share some information about and some data to show the trends over the last year or so and how things have changed. Our Watch for Me NC program, so that's really the safety program, and some of the planning projects as well. So that was the goal with the presentation, was to provide that really well-rounded view of the entire bike and pedestrian program.
Okay. I think that sounds great, and I think my sense is that will be another full meeting, because that's a lot. And I know several of us have already expressed a really keen interest in the safety and the communication and education components. And then from there, looking at those trends, because as I'm trying to think through how we help prioritize, since that's one of your asks of us, is that we help prioritize the existing plans as to what happens next. That information will probably lead into that. And then from there, I think we're set up to moving into how we communicate and how we collaborate and what that actually looks like logistically.
Sure.
That makes sense.
It does, yeah.
We have 1 minute left. Any other comments from today? This was really helpful for me. I appreciate all of the information.
I had, last meeting we brought up kind of what were some measurable goals that this committee could work towards, and I was just thinking a little bit more about that. And I know years ago that Winston-Salem CAN had done a lot of preliminary work on bicycle benefit businesses. So that could be something that we could, try to get a whole slew of businesses involved in that. To a grander scheme of hopefully working towards raising our designation from the League of American Bicycles. Right now, probably we're a bronze, probably all thanks to Matthew. I'm not sure before he came along if that was the case, and I could be wrong, but I just think there's a lot going on in our city, and if we could bump that up to a silver designation or something, I'd like to kind of investigate the criteria and see where we're at and how we're lining up to improve that designation.
I think that's one of the goals in the master plan, is to have a silver designation, as I remember when I looked through it.
That's correct, yeah. And Michael, that's a great idea, because the timing is good, and I think we are due for reapplication in 2021 here. So I think that's something we could certainly add to the agenda. I could provide some information about what that program is and the criteria that they evaluate for each community, and actually start working on a reapplication.
Would that help us with our prioritization?
Prioritization of
projects?
Not necessarily. I think the league is looking at what you have done, and the plan would certainly be, they want to know that you have a plan in place, but they're not necessarily looking at specific projects, corridors that you're looking at. The application is lengthy and it's very involved, but they're looking at generally what you have in place, if it's the items that you need to have in place to build a bicycle-friendly community.
Okay, great.
And I went on the website, and I was able to look up Winston-Salem specifically, and they give a whole rundown of where we stand and recommendations on to get the steps to silver. I don't know, that was very interesting for me to look at. And another aspect of that, it was just local bicycle-friendly universities. We have 0, whereas we have 5 universities here. So I think there's a good opportunity to kind of enhance that, which overall, obviously there's a lot of individual tasks that can take place within the overarching goal of that. But I just thought that'd be fun and worthwhile to get involved in.
I love these ideas. This is great.
Could we share that link in the minutes? So we can all look at that.
Yep. I'll make sure to put that in there.
Okay, we are past time and should probably wrap up. Any other comments for now? Are we all okay with the plan to have Matthew do part 2 for our February meeting?
Yes.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matthew. This was helpful.
Yeah, happy to do it.
Just so you'll know, February is my birthday month. I just thought I'd throw it out there.
We will be sure to remember that. Fantastic. Okay, do we need a motion to adjourn? Or are we just good to go?
I think motion approved. How about that?
Sounds good.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
See you next month.